Jean Schnupp here with a little known gem of a destination travelogue from Savvy Sightseer. I'd like to first mention that there's a little change in my website, and for those who are familiar with the old format, you will now see that things have been categorized. So to look for today's program's pictures and commentary, what you'll need to do is go to European destinations and then scroll down until you find today's title. So now, welcome to the Isle of Man. You'll soon see why I say it's complicated. First of all, its people, culture, and such are referred to as Manx. The small island, only about 220 square miles, sits in the middle of the Irish Sea, pretty much equidistant from its UK neighbors, Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But it could be a zillion miles away because it is not technically a part of the United Kingdom. It's had quite a mixed ancestry of ownership. First colonized by Irish missionaries in the 5th century and then taken over by the Vikings. A Norse king sold it to Scotland in 1266, which later lost it to King Edward I of England, known as the Hammer of the Scots for his brutal treatment of his neighbors. After a period of alternating rule by the kings of Scotland and England, the island settled under English crown rule, with feudal lords running the place in exchange for homage and fees, including 2 falcons presented to each new monarch, a tradition that continues to this day. But in King Charles III's case, it wasn't live falcons, but rather a handcrafted wooden bowl inlaid with peregrine falcons made from recycled silver. Feudal reign of the little island nation continued until the 1400s. At that point, the land, as well as the title of Earl of Derby, was given to Sir John Stanley as a reward for suppressing a Welsh rebellion. It stayed in his family for over 3 centuries. British royalty started taking a keen interest in the island in the 1760s, though, when it had turned into a smuggling haven where goods could be dropped off and later distributed, avoiding customs agents at the designated port of Liverpool, England, just 80 miles to the southeast. In 1765, pressure stemming from all those lost taxes was brought to bear on the owners, which led them to sell the island to the British Crown. That means it is the property of the monarch, not the British government. It's still a tax evader's port of choice of sorts, since it is a separate entity and is politically autonomous with its own currency, the Manx pound. It isn't subject then to UK governmental regulations and taxing schemes. Investors are drawn by Man's low tax rates and other incentives, and over the last few decades, the island has developed highly respected finance and offshore banking sectors and is recognized as a well-known tax haven. The profitable smuggling trade gave rise in the 17th century to a sheltered port city on the east coast, Douglas, which continued to grow rapidly both in terms of importance and population. Once smugglers were squashed, and as steamships came on the scene, tourism became a lucrative business among Victorian vacationers and continued to fuel Douglas's growth. Bringing visitors to the island since 1830, the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company, the oldest continually operating passenger shipping company in the world, is still the best way for 21st century travelers to get across the Irish Sea from England to Douglas's crescent-shaped beach. A grand promenade had been built in 1876, further enhancing the town's role as a place to see and be seen. Today, Douglas serves as the Isle's capital city, center of government, base of business, and home of the largest percentage, about 1/3, of the Isle's population. By the late 1800s, the seaside resort also boasted Europe's largest dance hall and even an opera house, centrally located on the promenade. The Gaiety Theatre and Opera House, thanks to several renovations, is today billed as one of the finest working theaters in the British Isles. Its stunning interiors enhance any stage production, which run the gamut from family shows, musicals, pantomimes, plays, to stand-up comedy acts and concerts. If you decide to pop in for a show, you might want to steer clear of seat B14. It's rumored to be the one of choice for an old lady still haunting the theater. The now 2-mile stretch of promenade recently underwent an extensive £25 million renovation, which officials declare makes this a world-class waterfront destination. Thoroughly modernized, it features lots of EV charging stations for modern all-electric vehicles. And the early 20th century sunken gardens between the promenade and shorefront have been updated and revitalized. A wide array of color and botany explode along the 3/4 mile route and even includes palm trees, thanks to the influence of moderate year-round weather due to the Gulf Stream, which makes snow, even in winter, a very rare occurrence. There's also impressive statuary. One sculpture, unveiled on the promenade in 2021, might have some people scratching their heads and wondering why there's a tribute to a pop singing group, the Bee Gees. Although most consider them an Australian band, they were all born in Douglas and are definitely viewed as some of the island's favorite sons. The brothers Gibb, Barry, Maurice, and Robin have been honored not just with the statue, but also by being featured on Isle of Man postage stamps. There's a collective one for official mail, as well as commemorative stamp sets issued for the group as a whole and individually for Barry and Robin. For their part, the band memorialized their birthplace by including its unofficial anthem in their last world concert tour in 1999. Though few would make the connection, since the song's title, Ellen Vannin, is the island's name in its native tongue, Manx Gaelic. All proceeds from the single of that song go to Manx charities. Robin Gibb also released an album, 50 St. Catherine's Drive, named for their childhood home address on Man. And Barry produced the Greenfields album, noting the green fields referred to were those of the Isle of Man during their childhood. Sir Barry, the sole surviving brother, has commented, "I'm very proud of my Manx roots. I was born and bred on the ancient, mystical, magical Isle of Man, and I have very fond memories of growing up there." While now equipped to support electric cars, Man's beautiful promenade nonetheless retains its connection to the past. Classic Victorian facades line the roadway. The stately Gaiety Theatre holds center stage, and historic horse-drawn trams, the world's oldest, still provide a leisurely way to enjoy the waterfront views, just as they have since 1872. Locals are quick to point out that these horses are well provided for. They have an average working life of 15 years, and for them, there's no trip to the glue factory upon retirement. Rather, they are trotted out to the home of rest for old horses, which sits on a tranquil 92 acres of countryside just outside of Douglas. To delve far into the Isle of Man's historical past, a visit to the Manx Museum, a short walk inland from the promenade, covers some 10,000 years of island life. It is constantly evolving, and in 2023, it unveiled a gallery devoted to the island's biggest annual tourist draw, a world-class road race. The more than century-old Tourist Trophy, or TT International, winds through a 38-mile route of Isle of Man streets, with some motorcycles flying by at average speeds of 135 miles per hour, challenged by more than 200 turns along the way, to the delight of some 50,000 onlookers who flood the city in early June each year. Brothers Ben and Tom Birchall designed and built their record-breaking machine, now featured in the museum. They have won 14 TT races and are noted as the first ever crew to clock over a 120-mile-an-hour lap in the sidecar class. For a bit of perspective, the bus I was on covered a portion of the TT route in 20 minutes. The same stretch of road flew by in only 3 minutes for the average TT racer. The museum also takes visitors through the Celtic and Viking eras, as well as into a few quirky areas, like the Cabinet of Curiosities. In an ever changing exhibit, island oddities are put on display, such as a tiny sugar sculpture of a giant water wheel, an even tinier steamship inside a light bulb, a fine necklace dated to 950 AD, found on a female who is buried with her worldly goods. There's an iron cast of the hand of Arthur Cayley, the so-called Manx giant, who was nearly 8 feet tall, which is not to be confused with the more delicate cast of a female's hand, reportedly found in the belly of a large codfish in 1932. Vikings may have left the Isle of Man centuries ago, but their way of ruling lives on. While the Parliament meets regularly in Douglas, the real action takes place annually up on Tynwald Hill, about 10 miles away, in the town of St. John's, which was more centrally located for all Manx residents to get to. The 12-foot by 80-foot man-made hill contains soil from each of the island's 17 parishes. Every July 5th, an open-air meeting of the island's parliament is held on the hill, just as it has since 979 AD. Seating mirrors legislative hierarchy. The top tier is reserved for the lieutenant governor and upper legislative council. One step down is for the lower council, known as the House of Keys, possibly a variation of an Old Norse word for to choose. The third tier is for other elected officials and dignitaries, and on the bottom level are judges and clergy. Laws passed during the year are read out in both Manx Gaelic and English, continuing the ancient oral method of handing down laws. And then the general public can present lawmakers' petitions to seek relief for a wrong through litigation or other action. The premise behind the historic process is that grievances can be aired and hopefully remedied quickly and peacefully. This type of interactive, participatory administration was a typical Viking approach for the representative governing. Man's Tynwald Parliament is considered the oldest continually operating one in the world, beating out Iceland's claim with the pivotal word continually. Iceland's parliament, the Alþingi, while formed in 930 AD, also by Vikings, did have a break in operations when under Danish rule. The day starts out solemnly, but once business is out of the way, it's time to celebrate. What had originally been a typical fair of the time is a much bigger event today, with concerts, Celtic festivities such as ceilidh dances, as well as firework displays and stalls of vendors. You know you are in a special place when locals warn you to make sure, as you pass over a bridge on your way into the island's capital, that you greet the fairies, or as they prefer to call them, the little people, with a hearty "Faster me," Manx for good afternoon or evening. Local legend spells out the consequences of not doing so. You'll fall prey to the malicious and mischievous whims of the pixies living there. Douglas may be the island's most visited port, but there's another seaside town, Peel, on the opposite coast, that predated its counterpart as the very first ruling center. It too was a smuggler's stronghold, but in its earlier days it was a base, first for Irish missionaries in the 5th century, then for Viking King Magnus, who fortified a tiny islet on the Peel coast with a castle in the 11th century. The 7.5-acre St. Patrick's Isle and Peel's sheltered harbor made it a strategic perch from which Magnus could oversee Viking interests in Ireland and Scotland, which was known then as the Kingdom of Man and the Isles. It's speculated the town's name is a derivative of an old Gaelic term for fort. Remnants of both the medieval cathedral and a castle remain standing. A replica of a Viking longboat, called Odin's Raven, is part of Peel's House of Mannanen, an in-depth collection detailing the Celtic, Viking, and maritime history of the region, as well as the origin of the island's name. Mannanen, according to Celtic lore, was a sea god who could wrap a cloak of mist around the island to protect it from its enemies. and who had the power to make 100 people appear closer to 1,000 to intimidate would-be invaders. Here you'll find some typical dioramas, like the sailmaker at work, but this exhibition center goes further than most, giving a whole new meaning to interactive by stimulating all 5 senses. The maritime sections showcase street scenes from Peel, such as traditional industries like fishing, boat building, and the production of kippers, complete with its smells. During the 19th century, mackerel and herring fishing were a major industry on the Isle, and many of the fishing boats were based at Peel. 100 years later, Peel is the center of what remains of the Manx fishing industry. An especially popular delicacy continues to be smoked herring, known as Manx kippers. They are famous the world over, and unlike ones from elsewhere, no artificial coloring is added to man's treats. Visitors can step into the daily life and experiences of 19th century villagers and even hear their stories and superstitions from the island's past. Without doubt, it was a hard life for the fishing villagers. Today, Peel is considered, statistically and culturally, the most Manx town on the Isle of Man. As locals explain, the close-knit seaside townspeople have retained more of their ancestors' traditions, an attachment to and identity with the colorful town. They still use old idiomatic turns of phrases, and typically, when asked where they come from, the answer isn't Isle of Man, it's Peel. The Isle of Man offers a unique bonus for visitors who want to add a dash of nostalgia to their agenda. They can travel around in style, on vintage railroads. As Douglas had filled to the brim with Victorian tourists, savvy business people saw the need to transport them to explore the rest of the island. And in 1870, the Isle of Man Railway Company was launched. 3 years later, the Isle of Man Steam Railway chugged out of Douglas. While the journey's routes may have changed over the years, the travel experience has not. And today, it is the ideal way to venture out to all parts south of the capital, winding through about 16 miles of charming countryside. The train's comfortable padded seating and relaxed pace makes the journey a unique experience. It steams along, taking about an hour to cover that nearly 16-mile stretch to Port Erin on the southwest coast, treating riders to the perfect way to enjoy idyllic views. While listening to the rhythmic clackety-clack of the drive rods, the engine chuffing along the rails, air pump hissing, and plaintive steam-powered whistle passing through the stations. Riders can even take it up a notch in a first-class carriage, like this one that I rode in. Settling in on the rich wooden interiors, with windows operated the old-fashioned way by pulling on leather straps, immediately transports travelers not just down through the countryside, but also back in time. And for a truly grand experience, take advantage of one of the many themed dinner parties aboard the elegantly restored dining car. Built in 1905, it is one of only a few fine dining narrow-gauge cars in the world. Even stations are special. The steam railway's terminus is at the Port Erin Depot and its classic Edwardian red brick building. It served as one of the locations for Thomas and the Magic Railroad, where the goods shed there was used as a workshop. The station building dates from 1904 and has been described as the most beautiful building in town. And across the tracks is a train enthusiast's heaven. The Railway Museum. Opened in 1975, its exhibits present a history of the Isle of Man steam railway system, which was the inspiration for the Thomas the Tank Engine stories. Several retired engines bring out the kid in everyone who ever wanted to get behind the controls. For an even more realistic experience, they can try out the Isle of Man's only railway simulator for a nominal fee. There's also carriages to explore, including the royal ones once used by the Queen and Queen Mother. The museum walls are lined with vintage advertisements, photos, and other memorabilia spanning from its inception in 1873. Plush toys, games, souvenirs, and various themed totes and mugs round out the displays. For a very different transit experience, there's the Manx Electric Railway, running north from its home in Douglas. With its fancy new promenades, modern charging stations for the expected influx of all electric cars, the city is really just going back to its travel roots. The railway has been ferrying visitors in its original Victorian and Edwardian carriages for more than a century. It is the longest narrow gauge vintage electric railway system in the British Isles. One car, dubbed Tram Number 1, which first hit the rails in 1873, holds a place in the Guinness Book of Records as being the oldest operational electric tram car in the world, still operating on its original line. Riders on the Manx have the option of enjoying the scenic coastal views sitting in an open-air carriage at the back of the two-car line or up front in one of the beautifully restored cars. At the Laxey station, about a half-hour's ride north of Douglas, many travelers switch to a little less cushy train. The Snaefell Mountain Railway, which has been bringing Victorian sightseers to the summit at more than 2,000 feet above sea level since 1895. The only electric mountain railway in the British Isles, the Snaefell climbs steeply on the island's only mountain, passing fields of gorse and heather, stoic sheep, and the now defunct Snaefell lead and zinc mine, scene of the area's worst mining disaster in 1897. Fortunately, it's just a short, albeit bumpy 5-mile ride to the real gem of this trip. Once you have reached Snaefell's peak on a clear day, it is said you may be able to see some or all of the 7 kingdoms: England, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, the Isle of Man, and the kingdoms of Heaven and Neptune. One thing you'll surely see along the ride is the real-life version of the miniature sugar cube water wheel you saw earlier, the Great Laxey Wheel, largest working water wheel in the world. At over 72 feet in diameter, it is considered an extraordinary feat of Victorian engineering. Built in 1854, it was nicknamed Lady Isabella after the wife of the then Lieutenant Governor, and it is the Isle of Man's most iconic landmark. Not just a pretty face, it was a workhorse that drew water out of the area mine, keeping the flow of lead streaming out to feed the ever-growing need for water pipes, roofing, etc. It was painted in bright red, black, and white so it could be clearly seen all over the region, a compelling symbol to everyone in the village and the island of the importance of Laxey and its mine. Over time, the wheel became a tourist attraction in itself, and more visitors came to the little town where they paid to climb the Great Laxey Wheel's 96-step spiral staircase to the top platform for a spectacular view of the valley. After the mine closed in 1929, the wheel kept turning and bringing in tourists. It was eventually bought by a local builder who in turn sold it to the Manx government in 1965. In 2022, an extensive restoration was launched, including a fresh coat of paint, restoring the Grand Lady to her Victorian splendor. And the Manx national icon really shines now, the triskelion, or 3 legs of man, with limbs joined at the hip, so to speak. The history of the 3 legs of man goes as far back as pagan times, and was originally a symbol of the sun and of power and life. Since about 1300 AD, a motto has been associated with the 3 legs of man. The symbol literally translates to, "Whithersoever you throw it, it will stand," a testament to the tiny nation's resiliency. Before a series of mishaps and disasters, both human and natural, led to Laxey's mine closing, it was one of the largest and most important sources of lead ore. The massive operation, which extended in excess of 2,200 feet below ground, is demonstrated through a scale model in the nearby Salmon Lake Center. The mine also produced significant quantities of zinc, silver, and copper. Water flooding the tunnels had been a repeated problem in early years. A massive storm once swept in, drowning 5 miners. It took more than 6 months to drain enough for mining to restart. The solution? A huge and powerful water wheel to ensure that couldn't happen again. At its peak in the mid 1870s, the mine employed around 700 men who extracted about 2,400 tons of lead ore and almost 12,000 tons of zinc ore in a single year. With its closing nearly a half century later, the once prosperous Manx mining industry met its demise. Google official website of the capital of the Isle of Man, and you might be surprised to be directed not to Douglas, but to Castletown on the southeast coast. Evidently, Google operators missed the fact that it lost that headline back in 1869. It had served as the island's capital for hundreds of years, though. Its roots go back to the 11th century when Viking leaders split their time between Peel on the west coast and Castletown on the east. In 1200, they built a fortified tower, Castle Rushen, and ultimately moved their center of power there permanently. The stronghold was expanded and became a large military complex. It continued to be the seat of power when the Lords of Man were in control, though they built more comfortable digs called Derby House on the property. When the island went back to the king, he appointed a lieutenant governor, who then moved into Derby House. When that was eventually needed to expand the courts, the head of state leased a lush estate nearby. When the lease expired, the then lieutenant governor couldn't, he claimed, find a suitable place to move in Castletown, and opted instead for renting rooms at the Castle Mona Hotel up in Douglas, while looking for a permanent residence in that town. So the change of capital came about because of a real estate issue, not a political one. Castle Rushen itself, meanwhile, was repurposed over the years as a mint, a garrison housing soldiers, and later as a prison, and even, for a while, as an insane asylum. It was let fall into deterioration over time until it wasn't even fit for prisoners, who were moved to a newer facility. And that might have been an end to the once mighty fortress, except in 1902, the lieutenant governor decided to restore it to its 16th century splendor as a heritage site and tourist attraction. The castle's clock, prominently displayed, is dated at 1597 and embellished with ELIZREG for Elizabeth Regina, Latin for Queen. It is thought to have been a gift to the island from Elizabeth I, and carbon dating of the original mechanisms back up the time period, more or less by 20 years. Approximate is also the actual time depicted, since there's just one hand. Seems in the 16th century, absolute precision to the minute was not deemed necessary. The lieutenant governor's decision to restore, not raise, the castle has paid off, and the fortress is considered one of the best preserved medieval castles in Europe. Mannequins sit in as Stanley rulers going about daily life. By the way, the Isle of Man offers a pretty good tourism deal for those staying several days and planning to see these museums and use various local transport. The Go Heritage and Explore Pass covers unlimited entry and transit use for 5 days at a very reasonable cost. Although the island's military is no longer housed here, it doesn't mean the town no longer sees battles, but it is naval warfare of a different kind. A very different kind. One that transforms the tiny mellow harbor into an armada of strange ships, battling it out for the honor of being the first to cross the finish line or the one who covers the farthest distance before sinking in the annual World Tin Bath Championships. It might come as no surprise the idea for the wacky tin bathtub derby was hatched in 1971 by a group called Castleton Real Ale Drinkers Society. It is all in good fun. The 100 or so contestants come from around the world, and all the money raised by the event goes to local charities. In 2016, the Isle of Man was awarded a distinctive title by the UNESCO organization. It became the first entire nation to be identified as a biosphere region. According to UNESCO, the Biosphere program began in 1971 and initially concentrated on care for land, sea, and species. It was expanded in the mid-1990s to also reflect an area's economy, culture, heritage, spirituality, and community. The Isle of Man pushes all the buttons, and officials contend it is a place that cares about its natural environment, is proud of its heritage, is home to a vibrant community, and has a resilient economy. Among the ways officials say locals can demonstrate their commitment to value their environment, culture, and heritage is by taking part in various island-wide events. One is stargazing. Man boasts 26 official dark sky sites, a designation indicating the isle has taken care to limit light pollution. All of the island's listings are classified as Milky Way sites. This means not only can you see the 7 main stars in the winter constellation Orion, but the Milky Way is visible to the naked eye. Another way to join is the annual Parish Walk, the biggest mass participation event in the Isle of Man, a 24-hour-long quest to walk an 85-mile stretch throughout the country, marked by a tap on the church door or gate of each of its 17 parishes. Roots of the event date back to the mid-1800s. The first to complete the challenge in June 2023 did so in just under 15 and a half hours, beating out over 1,000 other entrants. And then there's the reminders all over town to politely do your share. One of the criteria for designation as a biosphere reserve states that the region, quote, be of significance for biological diversity conservation. One unique species on the island was considered for this category, but unfortunately was deemed more of a curiosity than being an actually important biodiversity element. Residents, though, don't quite agree and think their Manx cat is more than just a curiosity, but rather a real symbol of diversity, given it is universally loved despite its oddness. It doesn't have a tail. No one is quite sure how the first cat came to be on the island, or what caused the genetic mutation affecting its tail. But there are plenty of hypotheses out there. One is that there was some kind of crossbreeding between cats and rabbits. And a largely held legend has a cat nearly missing the boat, so to speak. Well, that would be Noah's Ark. The latecomer lost its tail while Noah was slamming the ark door as flood waters rose. The cat is revered and featured in the Manx Museum. There is also a Man Cat Sanctuary and even a Manx Cat Cafe, where you can have, as the owners say, light snacks and hot and cold refreshments in a warm and welcoming environment where you can relax with a few of our Manx cats. The cat species isn't the only island oddity. There's also the Manx Lochtan, a rare breed of sheep native to the Isle of Man that sports up to 6 horns. It is believed the Vikings introduced the multi-horned woolly mammals whose name translates to mouse brown, referring to the color of the adult animal's fleece. They believe they brought it to the Isle of Man some 1,100 years ago. Today, it is designated as a rare species. I like to end all of my programs with the words of Dr. Seuss. Sometimes you don't appreciate the moment until it becomes a memory. But I like to add to that, always remember to celebrate the moments and treasure the memories. I hope you've enjoyed this visit to a tiny but formidable country, keeping its independence amid a sea of kingdoms. Remember to check my European Destinations tab to revisit the Isle of Man anytime. Should you have any questions about this program, email me or use the contact page on my website, which is also where you can visit any of my other European or USA destinations. And don't forget to check my Programs tab to see flyers describing each of my programs, available in video format, in addition to a listing of which ones I'll be presenting in person and where. Contact your library or community center to confirm which version they are making available. I also recommend you check out my Tips tab for the latest regulations kicking in for both domestic and international travel, especially for acceptable forms of identification and documents we will now need to travel to the UK and EU countries. A US passport alone will no longer be sufficient. Maybe Isle of Man will now top your vacation to see list. Show slant or cheers in Manx.